A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. It's our great pleasure to warmly welcome all of you, and especially to extend a heartfelt welcome to our distinguished guest, Dr. Lahmar. Dr. Lahmar is an assistant professor of education at the College of Islamic Studies and is senior fellow of Higher Education Academy, UK. Her academic expertise spans comparative education, Islamic education, decolonial methodologies, and identity formations. She holds a PhD in education and an MA educational research method from the University of Nottingham, where her research focused on diversity in British Muslim schools. In addition, she earned an MA in Islamic Studies from Lahmar University and a BA in Quran and Sunnah Science from Amir Abdel Qadir Islamic University, Algeria. Dr. Lahmar has also undertaken extensive professional development at the University of Oxford, the Open University UK, and Birmingham Newman University, with a particular focus on digital pedagogies, online learning, and emerging educational technologies. Throughout her career, she had held academic and research positions at the Open University, the University of Nottingham, and the University of Bolton at the Open University UK. She contributed to the Decolonizing Education for Peace in Africa project, where her work explored Algeria's artistic heritage as a means of promoting reconciliation and mutual understanding among diverse communities. Her research critically examines knowledge production, ethical reasoning, and the ontological foundations of education, while advancing alternative educational frameworks that emphasize rationality, wisdom, and holistic human development. We are truly honored to have Dr. Lahmar with us today, and we look forward to a rich and inspiring session, inshallah. Please, you can continue.
Jazakumullah khairan, thank you so much, and it's my honor to be with you today. Thank you so much. So again, thank you so much for the invitation. It's my honor to be with you today. Talking about philosophy, education, and Islamic civilization, we question whether education is neutral. And my stand on it is education is never neutral. A philosophical entry, therefore, into Islamic educational thought is necessary. Let me begin with a claim that is both simple and I would argue as well unavoidable, and we have to make it, to emphasize that education is never neutral and is always value-driven. Every educational system, whether religious or secular, whether ancient or modern today, rests upon assumptions, ontological of being, of the existence, and epistemological of knowledge. About knowledge, about the human subject, or understanding of who's the human, about the purposes to which learning should be directed. Even systems that explicitly deny having a moral or a religious or metaphysical framework are already operating within one, but could be implicit and not explicitly shared. So what distinguishes then civilizations is not whether they educate, but how consciously they reflect on that, on what education is for within that civilizational framework. Islamic civilization was explicit about this question. Education in its classical formulation was not treated as a technical process. It was understood as a moral and civilizational practice, one that shaped how individuals related to truth, authority and responsibility. Means when we ask about education, we are thinking about to educate what is education and to what is a human being. How can we understand the faculties of the human being and what faculties should be educated? So these questions are essential, therefore, to any education proposal. So to understand this philosophy of education, however, we must resist a common methodological error by beginning with institutions. What are the institutions, how they are formed? This is the history of institutions, but it doesn't give us the philosophy of the foundations of education. So schools, curricula, examinations tell us very little on their own. They are downstream expressions of deeper commitments. For example, if the examination, when we're saying how to examine, we are also asking questions about how to understand. And we are also asking questions, what skills do we need? And what faculties do we have? See, it's not detached. They're really related together. So if we want to understand Islamic education philosophically, we must begin with how knowledge itself was conceptualization. Education, what is education? What is knowledge? And then we get into philosophy. Even those who say, I'm not interested in philosophy, they have their own philosophy of education because they have their own view of the human being. They have their own view of the truth. They have their own view of what knowledge is. So one of the most revealing entry points is the opening of the Quranic text, the first verses that have been revealed, Surah Al-Alaq. اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق اقرأ وربك الأكرم الذي علم بالقلم علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم. These verses that were the opening of, the first revelation of the Quran, which is the Muslims' sacred book that we learn from how to be true Muslims. These first, are foundational verses, are foundational theory of knowledge for Muslims. The first revealed passages, these verses do not begin with jurisprudence, fiqh, or ibadah. It means the ibadah, I mean ritual, I mean like a prayer. Otherwise, all our life is ibadah. It begins with an epistemic, means a knowledge act, read. Yet this act is immediately framed. It's not to read anything or read within any worldview. You have actually a frame. Read in the name of your Lord who creates. From a philosophical standpoint, this is significant. It represents the framework of being. The act of knowing is not presented as autonomous, like in some philosophies. So you can learn whatever. You can learn within any framework. Actually, as a Muslim, you have to learn through that framework in the name of your Lord who creates. The act of knowing, therefore, is not presented as autonomous, as I said. It is situated within a relationship, an ontological foundation. When I say ontological, I mean the philosophy of being, how to understand existence. We understand existence here that Allah creates. Therefore, we have this ontological basis of education. You are not going through just coincidence being in this universe. So this actually foundation of being will shape the orientation and the moral horizon for this education. What is your moral purpose? What is the direction of the education that you are seeking or you are proposing? So knowledge here in Islam from the outset is accountable. For knowledge, you are created by your Lord and you will be accountable in front of him in the day of judgment. So it established a pattern that recurs through Islamic intellectual history. Learning is never detached from questions of being. Who are you? Who am I? Responsibility, purpose. What is your purpose in life? And human limitation means this is also علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم. So the human being, they are ignorant, basically. So there is a human limitation. These understandings are essential for philosophy. We are at the heart of philosophy now, just by reading the early verses that have been revealed, the first verses that have been that were revealed to the Prophet ﷺ. The passage then interrupts the comment to read with a reflection on human origin, the human being as conditional, dependent, and fragile. From an educational perspective, this is crucial. The learner is not addressed first as confident, rational being, independent, but as being marked by limitation. Epistemic, when I say epistemic, I mean the knowledge. Here, humility. So it should be a humility in seeking knowledge. And this humility is built onto the very foundation of learning. I'm talking now about foundations of Islamic philosophy. So I'm talking about being now is about the humility, the limitation of the learner. This stands in contrast to modern epistemological models that often assume the learner as a self-authorizing subject, capable of mastery through method alone. So Islam is saying no, actually, the learner is ignorant and the learner has limitations. And these kind of understandings, they have huge consequences on curriculum, on assessment, on pedagogy, on institutions, how we form institutions, even how we, the architecture of institutions. Also, they are influenced by our understanding of the learner, of the being. Islamic educational thought did not deny reason or method, but it consistently resisted the idea that knowledge could be safely pursued without moral orientation. So, and I cannot emphasize this enough. That is the knowledge is attached to moral orientation from the beginning. If we read through the verses, and I would like you now from now on to read the Quran through an educational perspective as well as we read it through a fiqh perspective, as we read it through, a different approach. Also, is Quran has hikmah in it, and there is a lot that we learn from it. The passage then, the verses introduce mediation, the pen, al-qalam, and finally concludes by defining the human being educationally as one who does not know and must therefore be taught. So, this human being, this learner is teachable, can be taught, and has ignorance and doesn't know. From a philosophical perspective, this is a remarkably dense educational anthropology. Is a foundation for education. So when I say this is also we go through the learner is limited. Taken together here is we are talking about the human being is not defined by innate knowledge. This doesn't negate fitra. This is another issue, nor by self-sufficiency, but by teachability. So we are not self-sufficient. We are in need. We have ignorance. But we have, as learners, there is a teachability, quality. Ignorance here is not a defect to be hidden. It is the condition that makes learning possible. So we don't have to run away and say we don't have ignorance. Actually, in Islam, acknowledging ignorance is part of learning. Taken together, these verses, this ayat, outline an educational framework with several implications. First, the learner is limited, as I said, not sovereign, like when you find in different philosophies. Education is inseparable from moral responsibility. This is a theory of education. Now we are at the heart, by the way, of theory of education. From this framework emerges a distinctive educational culture. Education in Islamic civilization was not primarily oriented toward accumulation of information or credentializing, to have more credentials, more qualifications, more. It was oriented towards formation, to format the self, towards the purpose of ibadah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So intellectual, moral, and social, this is all about formation from within. This explains why learning historically took place across multiple social spaces. Not only in the, in informal institutions. If we say education in Islam is not only in schools. It starts, at homes. You remember Dar al-Arqam ibn Abi al-Arqam in Ghar Hira, around Mecca, around Al-Kaaba, I mean. In every relationship, there is an opportunity for education. This explains why learning historically in Islam took place across multiple, as I say, spaces, not only informal institutions, as I said, masajid, for example, households, libraries, markets, and scholarly circles, all functioned as educational environments. Education was interwoven with life. It's not something separate before life. Education is from day one. We are in education before day one. Even before our birth, our mothers should educate us by dua, by even now the what they say, music. The mom can actually hear. The baby can hear. The fetus can hear. Later on, when they developed the sounds outside. So this is part of education. So education was interwoven with life rather than being something preparatory phase before life. And this is essential as well, because there is a lot of debate about the spaces of education, where education should take place, and at what phase education should be provided. The educated person was not simply someone who knew more, as nowadays more information, more qualification. In Islamic civilizational view, from the start, it was someone who had acquired a different relationship to knowledge, one shaped by piety, taqwa, self-discipline, accountability, muhasaba, and judgment. So all these are parts of the journey of education. This also clarifies why Islamic education historically resisted sharp separations between aql, or intellectual training, and akhlaq, or moral formation from within. They are not separated. They are not to be separated. From its own philosophical standpoint, separating the two would have been incoherent from an Islamic worldview. Knowledge that increases power without increasing self-discipline and muhasaba was viewed not as a progress, but at risk. Risk to the self, risk to others, risk to to Allah's creatures around us, because there is no muhasaba from within. So this concern is not unique to Islamic thought. In some other philosophies, we find something in different forms. But what is distinctive in the Islamic case is the systematic way these concerns were integrated into mainstream, educational practice, rather than relegated to marginal ethical discourse. We find them within the sheikh, with his students or her students. They will find themselves after the halaqah. They go to prayer together, salah together. They may have reflections. They may have qiyam al-layl. They may have a journey together. So this is because the rational and the information and the moral, they are together. They are not separated. It is important, however, not to idealize this heritage. Look at the past as something ideal that we are looking to, looking forward to have it back, because that's was suitable to those circumstances, and it's a human experience and human understanding, and therefore, as humans have limitations, the human experience also have limitations. Separate that from the Quran and Sunnah, because this is wahi, this is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Quran, and the Prophet ﷺ only says from the revelation as well. So Islamic educational history then contains exclusions, contains failures, and contains periods of success and periods of stagnation as parts of a human experience. Philosophical clarity, which we explained how philosophical education and from an Islamic perspective is clear, and that excellent framework, the Quranic framework, does not guarantee historical success for Muslims, because the understanding and the implementation are different from the revelation. But clarity of the worldview remains crucial and very important. Islamic civilization, as its best, knew what education was for. It possessed an articulated sense of educational purpose that governed institutions, pedagogy, and authority. And if I ask you now, I will stop for 1 minute and ask you to just write down what is education for from an Islamic perspective.
Okay, please write down what is education
Yes, please.
from perspective. Yeah.
This is so important. Otherwise, I will not ask you for answers, but this will be important to continue. Okay, so as long as they reflect, we come back, because that's the whole purpose is not today. They don't have to share, but they have to, to try to think through it. Even if they don't write it, there is something there. And so what I'm saying here, Islamic civilization is about what education was for. And we are all educators, by the way, because we are all having relationships around us. So this clarity is precisely what later thinkers, such as Muhammad Tahir bin Ashur, would argue had been lost in late. So this brings us to the critical question that will guide the remainder of the discussion today. If education is never neutral, then decline in education cannot be explained merely by institutional decay or external pressure. It must be explained by a shift in how knowledge, the learner, and purpose are understood. So because there is a lot of debate on the reasons for decline, why is the decline, the Muslim decline, why this is happening? So we may ask some questions. What happens to an educational system when learning becomes detached from moral self-regulation? When reading becomes a technique rather than orientation guided by clear purpose? We read and read and read without purpose. Or we have the education system, but that education system doesn't care for the moral or self-regulation of learners, self-discipline, judgment or accountability. So when knowledge becomes possession, when we possess knowledge as something of social status or rather than responsibility, what are the consequences of this? To address these questions, we must next examine how Islamic civilization understood the inner formation of the learner, and why concepts such as tazkiyah and adab functioned as educational, not merely spiritual categories. So when we are talking about these concepts, we are talking about ta'lim, we are talking about tarbiyah, we are talking about tazkiyah, we are talking about adab, ta'deeb, we are talking, those all, they tackle different aspects of education. So here, if education is never neutral, as we have discussed, then neither is the learner. So the learner also, they have positions, they have pre-assumptions, they have, this may sound obvious, but it is a point modern educational theory often struggles to acknowledge directly. So there is a lot, what the learner is they're coming from their own interests, they're coming with motivations, they're coming with biases. So in Islam, these are taken into regard from an Islamic worldview, and has to be also an approach to discipline that self. Much contemporary discourse treats the learner as a largely cognitive, rational subject, someone whose primary educational challenge is access to information, skill, acquisition, or conceptual clarity. Islamic educational thought began from a different premise. So Islamic education here, as I said, began from a different premise. It assumed that the learner approaches knowledge already shaped. They are shaped by ambition, by fear, by desire for recognition, by social competition. These are just examples, by envy, by lots of issues they come with when they come to the space of learning. So learning, in other words, here does not take place in a vacuum. It takes place within a self, and that self can cooperate with knowledge or distort that knowledge. From this perspective, ignorance was never seen as the only obstacle to education, or even the most dangerous one. And this is important. So it's not only about whether the learners are thinking rationally or whether they're gaining the certain skills. Knowledge itself here becomes a problem. Not because knowledge is harmful, but because it amplifies whatever dispositions already exist. The dispositions, I mean here, dispositions of learners. As I said, they come with their own background within the self. Education sharpens motives as much as it sharpens intellect. It can deepen judgment, but it can also deepen arrogance. Islamic civilization took this risk seriously. That's why you find many books about tazkiyah, and if you read about Al-Ghazali in Ihya Ulum al-Din, you read about Al-Muhasibi, you find a lot about this. Rather than assuming that education naturally civilizes, if people are educated means they naturally be civilized. This is questioned within Islam. It asks a more difficult question. What must happen to the learner so that knowledge does not become destructive, as we've seen in Gaza for the past 2 years? So what must happen to the learner so when they gain that knowledge and develop those skills, they don't use them for destruction? It is here that the concept of tazkiyah from within Islam, purification, self-purification, enters, not as a spiritual slogan and something to be isolated from the world, but as an educational response to a real problem. So tazkiyah is often translated as purification, as I mentioned, but that translation can be misleading if it is heard in a purely devotional terms for people who isolate themselves in certain places. This is not how tazkiyah within education is at all spheres of life. Even when we are with people in markets, we need tazkiyah at those moments. In the context of education, tazkiyah refers more precisely to moral self-formation from within, the shaping of the learner's relationship to Allah, the self, their relationship to the self, their relationship to knowledge, their relationship to society, their relationship to authorities. The concern was not really of moral perfection. As human beings, we have limitations. We will do mistakes. That's why one of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is At-Tawwab. So is the one, He accepts our tawbah whenever we do tawbah, repentance. Why? Because we, our understanding, Islamic civilization, or understanding of the being of the learner, that we are learners, we also do mistakes. So what we need here, it's the concern is about moral orientation. So the questions perhaps will be, why does one want to know? Why? What is one seeking through learning? And how does recognition, authority they gain through education or competition, shape intellectual conduct? What are the implications of this education, after they have been educated, they develop themselves? These were not considered private questions, irrelevant to education. They were considered educational questions, and they are at the heart of philosophy of education. This is why classical Islamic texts speak so frequently about intention. If you read any book of Islamic education classics, you will find the intention. Even Sahih al-Bukhari, you will find the beginning, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ وَإِنَّمَا لِكُلِّ امْرِئٍ مَّا نَوَى. That hadith, some scholars consider the hadith as a third of knowledge. Others consider the hadith as half of knowledge. The reason, because, as I said, because intention, sincerity, self-observation are the core of Islamic education. Not because scholars were obsessed with inner states, but because they recognized that learning is vulnerable to corruption from within, not only from without. And this is so important. You know, people can be highly skilled rationally, can make debates, reasoning, can make logical reasoning, but to cause destruction, not fairness. Why? Because there is a corruption from within. So a learner driven primarily by prestige, for example, to get qualification and prestige, to get more ijaza, you know, to memorize the Quran, be hafiz. You know, any is not necessary, even in Islamic scholarship, we may find this type of inner corruption. A learner driven primarily by prestige will use knowledge differently, for example, from one driven by understanding, by seeking the truth. And they are ready to be to have the humility to accept the truth, even if it contradicts their own self desires. Why? Because they have that self discipline. A scholar motivated by dominance will argue differently from one motivated by understanding, seeking the truth, or seeking clarity. So education, therefore, here had to engage also motivation. Motivation is at the core. We cannot just bracket it. So one of the thinkers who articulated this most sharply, besides Al-Ghazali, and also we find Al-Harith Al-Muhasibi, although often associated with ethical or spiritual reflection, the Al-Muhasibi's work is best read as an analysis of how the self interferes with the truth-seeking. What in Al-Muhasibi, Al-Muhasibi observed, and what later educators took seriously, is that the greatest obstacles to learning are often invisible to the learner themselves. You will find them as well in Ihya Ulumuddin for Al-Ghazali and others. Self-deception, rationalization, and the hunger for approval can coexist quite comfortably with intellectual sophistication. So we can have someone who's intellectually sophisticated. They memorize the Quran, they have philosophies, they read, they different disciplines, they highly, in terms of information and skills, they highly qualified. But they have hunger for approval, or they have self-deception. So in this case, how knowledge, what are the the consequences of that on the due to the skills they have and knowledge they have. From an educational standpoint, this meant that learners required the parallel practice of self-awareness. So self-awareness in Islam is essential to be educated. Not only to get information or develop rationality is to be educated. Not contemplation for its own sake, but attentiveness to how knowledge is being used, is the presence, al-hudur, that to attentive, that okay, I've learned that, I'm going to use it. For what purpose I'm going to use this knowledge? And what is the intention, why I'm learning this? This is why al-Bukhari, rahimahullah, placed the hadith, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ وَإِنَّمَا لِكُلِّ امْرِئٍ مَّا نَوَى at the start. This is at the heart of Islamic educational philosophy. Closely connected to this is the concept of adab. So adab is often flattened into good manners, but in educational context, it functions at a deeper level. It regulates how one inhabits knowledge socially, how one listens, disagrees, teaches, and claims authority. I wonder if you are still with me, because I cannot see. Yeah, okay, I can see you now. So here, I hope that gives kind of an overall picture of map of the interrelated concepts of Islamic education. Here, contemplation is essential because it's part of the ontology of discipline of the self from within. Closely connected to this concept is the concept, for example, of adab. أدبني ربي فأحسن تأديبي. Adab is often flattened into good manners, and we use it in modern Arabic language. Ta'dib means to have manners, etiquettes with guests, with the family. But in educational context, it functions at a deeper level. It regulates how one inhabits knowledge, the adab with ilm, the adab with the information that we've just learned, the adab with the skill that we've just learned. So it also regulates knowledge socially. How can we use this knowledge socially? How one listens, disagrees, teaches, as I say, claims authority. If they're in place of authority, like become a teacher, for example, how they are going to, their adab with the learners, and not only the adab of the learner with their teachers. From a philosophical point of view, adab can be understood as a way of stabilizing intellectual life. It seeks to prevent two symmetrical dangers: authoritarian closure on the one hand, and destructive skepticism on the other. So one hand, complete skepticism, the other hand, blind imitation and authoritarian closure of knowledge, don't question at all. Both of them are dangers to knowledge, because both of them lack adab. Disagreement, therefore, is not excluded. It should be expected towards reaching the truth. In some places I've noticed, some teachers, they consider their students, if they question their opinion, they lack adab. That's not what adab means within the Islamic worldview. About what is discipline is is not to disagree. Actually, this is something, if you see the truth and you have evidence, you can, as a learner, to say that the teacher, okay, understand this, but, and you find this and this and that. But how? The discipline is in the manner in which disagreement occurs. This is where adab is. Adab is, in this sense, is less about politeness and blind imitation. Is there more than is about epistemic responsibility. You are holding responsibility. You want the responsibility of the learner and the teacher is to seek the truth. Is not only to make someone comfortable. Is about the truth, seeking the truth in the best way, al-ahsan, in the best way possible. So there is an epistemic responsibility and the inner sincerity and truthfulness. This framework also shaped how teaching itself was understood. Teachers were not simply transmitters of information. They were participants in a moral economy of knowledge. And akhlaq comes at the heart of that. Their credibility depends not, if you look for scholars before, you find that their credibility not only about how much they memorize or how much they know, even though this was much appreciated, but their credibility depends not only on what they knew, but on how they embody their knowledge. It's their practice of knowledge. This did not mean teachers were expected to be flawless and perfect. It meant that education was recognized as relational. So there is a vertical relation with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and horizontal relation with people and with nature around us. There is adab also with nature around us. Learning occurred within relationships of trust, credibility, and role modeling between the teacher and the learner. From a sociological perspective, this helps explain why personal reputation and ethical consistency mattered so much in Islamic educational history. So people, they may, travel and they spend all their savings to learn from a sheikh that who had great credibility. So the sheikh is more important than the institution. It's not like today, the institution, the name of the institution. Are you graduating from Harvard or from this university, from Oxford, Cambridge, where that's about the institution. But before was about the sheikh. It's not about the Nizamiya, it's about al-Ghazali who's teaching. So the credibility there, and this is very important as well, differentiation between the modern structure of education and the Islamic heritage of education. So in this, we have to see if we really step back from all that detail. Broader pattern becomes visible to us, I hope. Islamic educational thought did not imagine education as the refinement of intellect alone. Intellect is there, because you find عقل in the Quran, قوم يعقلون, you find a lot in the Quran. But the intellect is part, is not everything. It imagined education as the formation of a certain kind of a person, is the holistic approach to education. Someone capable of judgment, restraint, they can actually self-discipline, they have responsibility, a wise person, and they have a purpose in life to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is the how education is the framework of education. So Tazkiyah named the inner dimension of that formation. There is a formation here, the layers of maratib al-wujud, as you find it in our Islamic classical heritage, the maratib, the layers of being. So Tazkiyah named the inner dimension of that formation within the self, while Adab named its social expression outside. When these dimensions function together, education could serve as civilizational perspective. Knowledge circulated without becoming purely instrumental or purely coercive. The teachers, they don't have to oppress their students to obey them, or to abide by their opinions. And actually is the opposite, is actually to open that space for them to grow and to even surpass them, like when you see with Abu Hanifa rahimahullah and Abu Yusuf or Zufar, you'll find Muhammad, you'll find that kind of debate if you read in Al-Quduri, or you read in Al-Ikhtiyar, or you read those such very interesting debates. When they, here, when you see here, what happened is, when the educational civilization, when the civilization weakened, learning did not disappear. So the decline of Muslims doesn't mean learning disappeared, no, but it changed character. It became performative, imitative, or detached from the purpose of maqsid. So it lost its ruh, its spirit, and it remains like shape. This brings us to the edge of our next problem that I would like to discuss with you today. If education depends on the holistic approach to knowledge and self-formation, then decline cannot be explained merely by institutional decay or external disruption, as I mentioned before. It must be explained by a shift in how learning itself is understood. What do we mean by learning? What do we mean by education? So let's ask some questions. You may think about some of those answers for yourself later. What happens when imitation, taqlid, replaces understanding? When authority, any type of authority, replaces seeking truth through critical judgment. When learning becomes credential rather than formation. How many ijazas do I have? How many qualifications do I have? From which university? But this is what learning becomes, credential, more things, collection of things. These questions were articulated from within the institutions of Islamic learning themselves. I'm not initiating those questions. They are there and they have been already raised. Most notably by Sheikh Muhammad Tahir bin Ashur, because we said we will focus today on the philosophy of Sheikh Muhammad Tahir bin Ashur, whose life and career provide the necessary context for its diagnosis of educational decline, and also he has his own philosophy of education. So at this point, we can finally turn to, inshallah, to this great scholar, this Tunisian scholar. He's named after his grandfather. So his father is called Muhammad, and his grandfather is called Muhammad al-Tahir. So he is Muhammad al-Tahir, the son of Muhammad al-Tahir ibn Ashur, Andalusi. They come from Andalusia. They have a heritage of scholarship. Muhammad al-Tahir ibn Ashur was born in Al-Marsa, just to give a because the context is important. The time context, because there are things that happen at the time, and also the geographical context will give us, and the history context of the scholar will give us kind of more in-depth understanding of their thoughts. So Ibn Ashur was born in Al-Marsa, as I mentioned, and they said in another place, but within the suburbs of Tunis, Tunis the capital. He was born in September 1879. That was just 2 years before the French occupation of Tunisia. The French occupation of Tunisia was in 1881. And that's a great change from the Ottoman Khilafah to the French in North Africa. So he was born into a family of deep scholarly scholarship, also judicial. They were in qada and political standing. The Ashur's family, or Al-Ashur, traced its origin to Al-Andalus, as I mentioned, and for generations, its members occupied senior roles in qada, judiciary, ifta, giving fatwas, and Islamic instruction at tadris. Even in Jami' al-Zaytuna, one of the great institutions of Islamic knowledge in North Africa. So the paternal line also already, his father is a Maliki jurist and judge, qadi, actively involved in legal scholarship and judicial administration. That's his father. And his grandfather, Muhammad Tahir bin Muhammad bin Ashur al-Andalusi, senior Maliki as well, senior scholar and judge, symbolic of the family's Andalusian intellectual heritage. By the way, even the son of Ibn Ashur, of Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur, his son Al-Fadil, is also a scholar. So he's a family of scholarship. The maternal line also of Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur also is a scholarly context. And this is when we talk about education, we are also talking about selecting the spouses, because that's kind of creating the environment of education, which is very important. So his uncle, his maternal grandfather, Muhammad Al-Aziz Bayram, a noted scholar as well. His uncle also is a noted scholar, as far as I remember. So he was like in an environment, very scholarly environment. Growing up in this environment, had access to excessive private libraries, to elite discussions, to insightful insights about the education system, because those scholars are at the heart of education reforms during the Ottoman Empire and later on during the French colonialism. So he was immersed from early childhood in legal reasoning, linguistic analysis, and scholarly debate. That is a formative context that profoundly shaped his later philosophy of education. By the way, even from Islamic education, the environment is crucial to the learning. As I said, education is not only institutions; it's everywhere. So that's why we come back here. What makes Ibn Ashur a compelling figure, in the philosophy of education, is not simply that he called for reform, and he actually called for reform for Zaytuna, which is classical Islamic institution. And Ibn Ashur, as we know him, is a scholar of Maqasid Sharia, is a versed scholar in multidisciplines, is in classical scholarship, so many actually asked for reform, not only him. What distinguishes him is the level at which he located the problem, and also his classical scholarship within the classical Islamic scholarship, and so he's coming from within, not from without, not from outside. He did not believe the crisis of education could be explained primarily by colonial pressure. Yes, there was colonial. Political decline, yes, there is political decline. Institutional weakness, yes, he acknowledged there is an institutional weakness, and he mentioned that in his book, أليس الصبح بقريب, when he started looking at the education from prior to Islam, and then through the early phase of Islam till and followed this up to his time in Tunisia. So although he acknowledged all these, he acknowledged the colonial pressure, he acknowledged the political decline, he acknowledged the institutional weakness, but he still has something else. Also, what is unique about him is not, he believed that the solution lay in simply, he doesn't believe that the solution lay simply by importing modern curricula or reorganizing schools. Come on, we reshape schools, we reshape institutions, we import some curricula successful in other places and it will work here. He doesn't believe in that. For Ibn Ashur, the crisis was intellectual and moral before it was structural. Education, he argued, he had its inner logic and purpose. For him, the education, even the Islamic classical education itself, lost the maqsid of education. So having the ijaza on al-Bukhari, yes, good, but look, what is the purpose? What is the maqsid of that? Memorizing the Quran, that's excellent, but what is the maqsid behind that? So that is what he is, he focused on. So one of Ibn Ashur's most striking moves is to insist that decline must be explained from within. The Islamic classical heritage, not only from without. We shouldn't only blame others for the situation that we are in. This is uncomfortable claim, and he knew it. And he faced lots of challenges in Zaytuna as a scholar and trying to reform. But this is his conviction based on his analysis. It is far easier for him that psychologically and politically to attribute educational failure to external domination. Ibn Ashur did not deny the effects, as I've mentioned, of colonialism, but he refused to treat it as the primary explanation. The primary explanation, he believes, is from within. External domination, in his view, succeeds most easily where internal intellectual weakness already exists. And there is similarity for those who read Malik ibn Nabi, an Algerian, in sociology thinker. He mentioned some of this, but they focus on two different things. But he also said, actually, we were ready for colonialism. That's why we have been colonized. So education, therefore, becomes the diagnostic site for Ibn Ashur. If a society no longer educates individuals capable of judgment, and I will come to what he meant by judgment here. So he say that authentic, if we don't really educate them to be capable of judgment, authentic, lively insight and responsibility, then it becomes vulnerable. They will become vulnerable, not only to political control, but to intellectual imitation and moral disorientation. So when Ibn Ashur speaks of exercising judgment, it's scattered around his books in Maqasid al-Sharia, in his book about education, أليس الصبح بقريب. He meant rational judgment oriented by maqsid, by purpose, and constrained by moral responsibility. Remember, he is a scholar in Maqasid, even his tafsir, At-Tahrir wa Tanwir, which is great tafsir. Linguistically, fiqhi, you name it. You read his tafsir, and please read it and immerse into it. You'll find lots of treasures in that tafsir. So we find here that he doesn't mean he's a scholar of Maqasid. So he's saying he means rational judgment oriented by purpose, by maqsid, and constrained by moral responsibility. It is not mere logical correctness. It's not about the capability, the mere, rationality. Not also the subjective wisdom, whatever, and not moral sentiment alone. They are together. More precisely for him, the education is about purpose, and therefore is about teleological rational judgment, or if I say it in Arabic, حكم عقلي مقاصدي. So تدريب, or to train حكم عقلي مقاصدي. intellect that think through maqasid al-sharia, basically, when they think about educational purposes. So not merely rational judgment هي حكم عقلي, because if we take maqasidi, the whole thing will change. So Ibn Ashur explicitly reject the idea that correct inference of formal reasoning is sufficient, like we find in many Western curricula, is about rationality, reasoning. So for him, that's not sufficient. Students may reason in valid way. They may apply the rules perfectly. They can cite authorities accurately and still fail educationally. Why? For him, because rational correctness أو صحة الاستدلال does not guarantee orientation or مقصد. They can have istidlal, but with the wrong مقصد. They can debate. We find people debated with the prophets before, with the messengers, and they had, but it's because with the wrong orientation, with the wrong maqsid. So for Ibn Ashur, therefore, logic or mantiq is necessary but instrumental. Judgment that stops at formal rationality, only rationality, risks becoming mechanical, imitative, or socially compliant. As you see, like in Gaza, we've seen some philosophers, they are justifying the genocide in Gaza. So rationality by itself or reasoning can be also used for wrong purposes if there is no maqsid that is guided by self-discipline from within. So judgment is more than logical validity. Judgment for Ibn Ashur, as I said, is more than only istidlal, صحة الاستدلال, is more about حكم عقلي مقاصدي. Just to, that concept, I will be using it later, so to put it into context. So at this time, then, Ibn Ashur does not collapse judgment into only moral feelings, and what I feel about morality is not only about consciousness or virtue ethics. He does not say for example, judge by intention alone, or judge by piety alone, or judge by moral sincerity alone. No, that would undermine the disciplines of fiqh. We end up into relativism about language, about reasoning. He worked so hard to preserve. He's from the classical school of usul al-fiqh, and for maqasid in the school of Shatibi and al-Ghazali, and so he's not someone to call for subjectivity, for example. Not subjectivity. Relativism. Sorry. So for him, moral concern without disciplined reasoning produces arbitrary judgments, sentimentality, or can be only populism, not real serious kind of judgment. So judgment is more than moral intuition. What Ibn Ashur actually means here is maqsid or purposive rational judgment. The best way to describe Ibn Ashur's concept is, perhaps if I have to reframe it, is judgment is the capacity to reason about particulars in light of purposes, consequences, contexts, and responsibilities. So this is, I worked through from his book of Maqasid al-Sharia, and the critique he provides in that book, and his book أليس الصبح بقريب. So in this way you find that actually you reason, but in your reasoning you take into consideration the maqasid of Sharia, and you take into consideration the consequences, because to achieve the maqsid you cannot achieve it out of context. You cannot achieve it. So you take the foundations, you take the halal and the haram, for example, if I apply it to Sharia, because it can be, I can apply it in other aspects as well. And the responsibilities. This is why his education philosophy is inseparable from maqasid, the theory of maqasid. The structure of judgment for Ibn Ashur, as I explained it already, just put it in differently, judgment involves the integration of three elements: rational, discernment, so correct reasoning. I mean هي الاستدلال الصحيح, correct reasoning, understanding causes, conditions, distinctions. Also we have purposive orientation or maqsid, asking why a rule, concept, or practice exists. Relating knowledge to human welfare, justice, and meaning. So moral responsibility, مسؤولية or أمانة, and he used that. This is the third point. So awareness that knowledge obligates. So you have knowledge, you have responsibility with this knowledge. We'll be asked about this knowledge. Accountability for consequences of application. We are in charge of that. So when we have this, we have the rational discernment, we have the purposive orientation or maqsid, and we have the moral responsibility, المسؤولية or amana. Then here, that's what we need for the integration of these elements that are involved within the judgment. If we don't have all of them, or we have just part of them, judgment fails when any of these dominates alone. So the dominance of one, no amana, no feeling of amana, but there is maqsid. We are aware of the maqsid, we are aware of there is a reasoning, but we don't have a sense of amana and mas'uliyah. So in that case will fail. Judgment will not be the best judgment. At the center of Ibn Ashur's diagnosis is a concept that appears repeatedly in his writing, which is taqlid, usually translated as imitation. But it is important to be precise here, because there is a misunderstanding where there are some people, and not only misunderstanding, there are some who call to reject all the heritage and start fresh. And when they start fresh, they don't start fresh, actually. They import from other sources the forms of education or, to revive. So that's not Ibn Ashur. That's not the imitation or taqlid that he meant here. Ibn Ashur was not condemning reliance on prior or previous classical Islamic scholarship as such, because he himself is at the heart of the classical Islamic scholarship. No education system can function without their heritage, because these are, the roots. What he was critiquing was the elevation of taqlid, of imitation, into an educational ideal. To have a school and the students, all when they graduate, they cannot deal with their society. All what they can do is recall texts, memorize those texts, and bring them on the table, on the debate. So you find them kind of out of context. This is what one of the critique about Zaytuna at the time, which was one form of the classical Islamic education. So in his view, therefore, education had come to reward repetition rather than understanding. They repeat, recall, preservation rather than judgment. So they want to preserve that book, memorize this matan, memorize this book. Great, he does not say don't. But he say, okay, where is the understanding? Preservation at what level? Is the preservation only of the words, or preservation of the maqsid of that scholarship? So students learn the answers without learning how those answers were reached. If you learn how Abu Hanifa rahimahullah came to this, or Imam Malik, or Imam Shafi, or Imam Ahmad, how did they come to this hukum? What is the reasoning behind that? So for him, arguments were memorized without grasping the reasoning that sustained them. And for him, this is so important for the students to grasp the reasoning behind those debates, not only to memorize the debates. As a result, learners appeared educated, apparently from outside. They appear so educated, while for him, they remained, intellectually dependent. They cannot reason themselves. They memorize the reasoning of others. So this for Ibn Ashur was not about, preserving the Islamic scholarship heritage. It was stagnation. These are two different things. Preservation for him is to preserve the soul of that heritage as well, not only the letters of it. So if we are at the surface level, for him this is stagnation. So what makes this critique especially sharp is that Ibn Ashur rahimahullah treats taqlid not as a moral failure alone, but as an educational pathology. An educational system organized around imitation produces particular kinds of learners. And he gave that kind of, he critically, you can read أليس الصبح بقريب. Sorry. So if you, particularly if you read about the kind of learners, he believes that the imitation approach to education produces learners who are cautious, who are submissive, who are anxious about deviation from that heritage, and ultimately incapable of creative engagement with the new realities. So when realities change from what they've learned in books, they're not able to deal with them. Such learners may defend inherited positions of scholarships. They may defend them vigorously, but they cannot extend them responsibly. They cannot take them forward in a responsible manner. They cannot revive them to move forward with authenticity. So heritage becomes something to be guarded, not something to be lived. This is really important, because if we cannot live to the soul of our classical scholarly heritage, then we are not preserving it at heart. We are just preserving, like, preserve a building from the outside, but there is no soul in it. So here we see a clear then continuity with the themes we discussed earlier. When education detached knowledge from the inner formation, I discussed before the inner formation and how learners come into the educational space to learn. They come with their own baggage. They come with their own self-dispositions. So when education detached knowledge from the inner formation, from moral responsibility, from self-discipline, from wise judgment, learning becomes fragile. It cannot adapt without breaking. It's really a superficial kind of learning. A second element of Ibn Ashur diagnosis concerns the confusion between the sacred and the human. So I've mentioned the first point was more about the imitation, the preservation at the superficial level. The other thing is the confusion between the sacred and the human. So over time, he observed interpretive traditions, commentaries, juristic fiqhi opinions, when you read al-mutun and al-hawashi and ara al-fuqaha, pedagogical manuals, they came to be treated as if they possess the same sacredness of the Quran, as if it's text revealed text, or as a sunnah, foundational text themselves. So he's very critical of that. This shift had profound educational consequences. If no differentiation, if we conflate the two, has lots of consequences on us. On Islamic, the Islamic classical scholarship, and on the Muslim Ummah, because consuming such education. If inherited interpretations are treated as sacred, then questioning them appears dangerous. Cannot question this, because as if you are questioning the Quran or the Sunnah. So rather than responsible, like the previous scholars, what they do, they debate with each other based on responsibility towards seeking the truth. No, it becomes closed and sacred. You cannot, it's dangerous. So intellectual humility, collapse into intellectual paralysis. Before, you have to be, if you have an opinion, you have to have the humility to be able to be questioned. Because this, the purpose is not the scholar, the purpose is the truth. In this context, the learner's task becomes to defend, is defense, not about understanding. And this is a kind of serious diversion. Instead of understanding, instead of comprehension, instead of engagement with the purpose, instead then becomes like I memorize to defend. Ibn Ashur regarded this as a catastrophe, a misunderstanding of the Islamic educational principles. For him, treating human interpretations as immune from critique does not protect Islam, does not protect Islamic classical heritage. It undermines it by severing the connection between the truth and reasoned judgment. So there is two, the truth and reasoned judgment to come to the truth. By severing the connection, we are harming, for him that we are harming and undermining the Islamic scholarship. Under such conditions, education trains loyalty rather than reasoned judgments oriented towards truth. This is really important point here for Islamic education. So are we training to loyalty towards scholars, or are we training to reasoned judgments oriented towards truth? Al-haq. She's called tahqiq here as well. So equally important is Ibn Ashur's critique of educational purpose or maqsid. He repeatedly returns to a simple but serious observation. Students no longer know why they are learning. They're learning, they don't know what they are learning. And teachers no longer articulate what learning is for. They're just memorizing text. Why? They don't know. Teachers, they don't know why they're teaching this. To have many ijazas, so what? What is after that? What is maqsid? What is the purpose of that? So education continues to function. Texts are taught, certificates are granted, but its orienting purpose has faded. And here, I have to make it clear, he's not saying don't learn those texts as such. Don't have ijazas or no. He's asking why do we remain at the surface level of it? Why do we miss the educational purpose of maqsid of it? So when this happens, education becomes vulnerable to two opposing but equally damaging tendencies. When we really focus on just the superficial layer and we miss the essence of judgment-oriented reasoned judgment that is oriented toward the truth, then we come to two opposing but equally damaging tendencies. On the one hand, it freezes into ritualized repetition. We have the institution, we have the books, students come, they read, they memorize the books, they go, and this is just repetition, but there is no essence of it. Also, on the other hand, it becomes vulnerable to uncritical imitation of foreign models, because we haven't prepared students to engage at the heart, to engage with the reasoning about the purpose. So what they do, they may end up some of them end up as frozen in time. Some of them, they end up as imitation and importing uncritically importing and imitating other foreign models. Why they cannot see, they cannot read through it and see the problems. In both cases, education loses its internal compass. Where is the internal compass? From within. So he's not someone to say that take the compass from others, saying no, the revival should be rooted from within our classical scholarship heritage. So what is especially interesting about Ibn Ashur is that he does not romanticize the past in order to make this argument. He does not claim that earlier generations were morally superior or intellectually pure. His claim is more precise. Earlier educational cultures preserved a clear relationship between learning and responsibility. When that relationship weakens, education loses its capacity to sustain civilization. So this is why Ibn Ashur repeatedly insists that reform cannot begin with institutions alone, with restructuring schools or universities. It must begin with restoring educational conceptual integrity. At this point, we can see how the threads of our discussion come together. If education originally rested on a holistic approach to knowledge, moral formation, and wise judgment, then decline emerges when these elements drift apart. So tazkiyah, for example, proceeds into private piety only, and not something we hold throughout. Adab becomes etiquette rather than epistemic discipline. Learning becomes performance rather than formation. And what remains is education in a superficial form, but not in a substance, as I mentioned. So Ibn Ashur's maqasid in his book, Maqasid al-Sharia al-Islamiyya, if you read that book, great book, articulates implicitly yet coherently. In that book, he's not discussing education. Education explicitly discussed this in his book, Laysa Subhu Biqarib. But if you analyze educationally his book, you will find the philosophy of education grounded in purpose, rational agency, and moral responsibility. Although the work is formally situated within legal theory, its conceptual architecture reveals an educational vision concerned with how minds are formed, how understanding is disciplined, and how knowledge serves human life. So you'll find a lot in his book. Central to this vision is the active role of the intellect. For Ibn Ashur consistently treats reason, understanding as something indispensable partner in the realization of revelation, of al-wahy. The intellect is not merely permitted, but required, حفظ العقل, required to analyze, infer, and judge. From an educational standpoint, this entails a rejection of pedagogies that train students in mechanical application or a reflective imitation. So an education for him, that suspends intellectual agency, undermines the very aims the Sharia seeks to achieve, as it makes the learners incapable from responding responsibly to new circumstances and emerging realities. There is a lot you'll find that in his this book. So you'll find that his method reflects an implicit pedagogy of as well of gradual in learning and order. His progression from general purposes to specific considerations suggests an awareness that understanding is cultivated gradually through the system. Education must therefore proceed with structure, clarity, and proportionality, respecting the learner's capacity and guiding intellectual development. He was critical of putting too much on the learners at early stages. In some, he is really believe that decline precisely because it was caused by things that we can identifiable intellectual shifts that could be reserved. Education could be reoriented. The purpose could be recovered, but the recovery would require from us courage, intellectual courage, because it would require rethinking inherited practices without abandoning inherited principles. So there is two different things: the principles, the roots, and the practices. This is where Ibn Ashur moves from critique to construction in later of his proposal. After one of the most important contributions to education philosophy, he insists on as I say, on the purpose, on maqasid, on the education renewal. For him is not innovation for its own sake. It is re-anchoring to the achieving maqasid sharia. The emphasis, the renewal in his view is required independent judgment. So this emphasis on judgment helps Ibn Ashur's interest in education as a discipline, and he actually made himself, he tried his best for many reforms throughout his, he was in a Zaytuna, and he proposed many reforms in there and led some reforms himself. For him is clear that scholarly heritage is not a museum. It is a living practice that must be understood, evaluated, and extended. And without having that purpose, we will live with it as a museum we visit and memorize. If you read another of his books, if you read it in, educationally, أصول الإنشاء والخطابة, he devotes sustained attention to language, composition, and rhetoric. He regarded clarity of expression as inseparable from clarity of thought. So for Ibn Ashur, the ability to articulate an argument responsibly is not only about style. It's not only about the skill on how to make it all sound so good, aesthetically so good. It is a moral and intellectual discipline. Poor reasoning, vague expression, and borrowed slogans are for him failures of judgment rather than merely being aesthetic failures. So he's looking at, at the skill of khataba, like the imam needs, nowadays with the media. He's looking at something that education should look at it at deeper levels. Rather than just the superficial articulation. An education that does not cultivate students to think critically, speak eloquently, with purpose, with maqsad, and with responsibility, and write with precision, cannot produce responsible intellectual agents. They can say things, they can write eloquently, they can in public spaces, but they cannot be responsible learners that Islamic education seeks to produce, regardless of how much information it transmits. So this is a concrete example of, and this is really applicable to everyday life for imams and their khutbahs of Jumu'ah every Jumu'ah, or to all of us who are engaged in speech in public spaces. This is a concrete example of what renewal looks like for Ibn Ashur. Not adding more content, more information, but training the faculties by which content is understood and evaluated. The same principle governs his view of the teacher. Ibn Ashur does not imagine teachers as neutral facilitators or mere transmitters of curricula, of knowledge, of information, I mean. Nor does he imagine them as unquestionable authorities. He's actually against that. He is for open space for students to question, but to question with adab, to question with etiquette, to question with purpose. He understands teaching as a form of moral intellectual stewardship. Teachers, in his view, shape what students know, not only what students know, but also they relate to knowledge itself. This is why he is, uncompromising about teacher preparation, teacher training. He's really, if أليس الصبح بقريب, you'll find him really pressing on teacher the need to teacher education. Poor teaching does not simply fail individuals, it damages the conditions of learning for an entire society. So this is something he emphasized a lot, that teacher training, because you see the failures not only for learners, is also for teachers. At the same time, he rejects authoritarian pedagogy. He's really against that. Authority that rests on fear or inherited status of scholarship and no one will question, underlines the very judgment education is meant to cultivate. Educational renewal, therefore, for him, requires teachers capable of explaining and guiding as role models, not merely asserting or controlling. And he was very critical of the harsh treatment and the lack of feedback, the lack of constructive feedback. You'll get surprised when you read his book, أليس الصبح بقريب, of how advanced in his thoughts at the time. What then of Tazkiyah for Ibn Ashur's philosophy renewal? If we come back to the Tazkiyah, here we must be careful. Ibn Ashur does not treat moral formation or tazkiyah as a separate religious program running alongside, as we said before. He treats it as an internal to the educational process itself, is part of it. It goes on with it. Learning for him must cultivate intellectual virtues, honesty, patience, attentiveness, moral responsibility, without which knowledge becomes socially dangerous. So, because education that shapes intellect without regulating motivation produces individuals who are clever but unreliable, can articulate brilliantly, but irresponsible. So for Ibn Ashur, sees this as one of the central failures of modern education. Not only in Muslim societies, he also critical of the Western model of education. Renewal, therefore, requires reintegrating moral self-regulation, self-discipline, tazkiyah, into intellectual training, not through preaching, but through how learning is structured, evaluated, embodied, because the learners, they learn from their sheikh. If the sheikh doesn't open any space for, they identify any mistake to tell him or question or ask him for evidence, then there is no embodiment for those values. So crucially, Ibn Ashur does not imagine renewal as a return to closed past. For him, he insists that education must remain responsible to change social realities, new disciplines, methods. He's open. Forms of knowledge are not threats by definition. He doesn't see other disciplines as threats by definition, but the way we approach them, the way we consume them in a way, this is the problem. They become threats only when adopted without clear purpose or judgment. His philosophy is most demanding. It requires educators capable of asking continuously some of the questions, such as, what does this knowledge, in every incidence of education, if we take his philosophy, the educators might ask, what does this knowledge serve? Whatever knowledge we are sharing, what kind of person does it form? And how does it affect responsibility, not only competence, not only skills? And these questions must be continually revisited. These questions are not to be asked at once. One incident is something ongoing. It's like questions for reflective practice. What we call in modern teacher training is reflective practice. For him, implicitly proposing these questions for practice, for educators. If we step back, a coherent philosophy of education renewal, we can see it emerging from that thought. So for Ibn Ashur, education must be oriented by purpose. There is a purpose, not only habits and imitation. There is renewal, must be restored critical judgment, not merely restructure institutions. Teachers must be formed as moral intellectual guides and role models. Language, reasoning, and ethics, akhlaq, must be integrated. Tradition must be, or heritage, must be engaged critically, not preserved mechanically and superficially. Modernity must be encountered critically, not imitated. So we can, learn from it, but also reject from that based on our maqasid. So in this way, this is like the final observation for Ibn Ashur, that he believes education is the deepest site of civilization or renewal, because it shapes how future generations will think, judge, and disagree as well. The question he ultimately leaves us with is not whether reform is possible, but whether we are willing to take education seriously enough to think about it at this depth. His book, أليس الصبح بقريب, I already introduced it many times, is important for anyone who is interested in Islamic education and reform. If I have to sum up for specific education reforms he mentioned in this book, first, recentering education on understanding, الفهم, rather than memorization, الحفظ. He does not reject memorization outright. Don't take me wrong on that, because memorization is something of our Islamic classical heritage, but he used memorization with fahm, with understanding. So he insists that memorization must serve comprehension, reasoning, and the capacity to apply knowledge meaningfully in ongoing changing circumstances, not memorization per se for its own and close the doors. So also he's proposing curricula and teaching methods should make priority explanations, questioning, so to prioritize explanation, questioning, and conceptual clarity over the mere retention of texts. This is the way to engage with text. The second point is reducing excessive dependence on commentaries and super commentaries. He criticized the dominance of shuruh, commentaries, and hawashi, marginal glosses, which had come to define advanced study in Islamic education, Islamic studies specifically. So the reform he proposed, students should return to foundational text al-usul and engage them directly, learning to identify central arguments. What are the central arguments, for example, for Abu Hanifa? What are the central arguments for Zufar or Muhammad or Abu Yusuf? How they agree or disagree. Understand original purposes and distinguish core principles from later additions. Also, third one, training students in judgment, or in Arabic, تنمية ملكة الحكم, the malaka which Ibn Khaldun mentioned. One of the most explicit reforms is the call to cultivate ملكة الحكم, the faculty of judgment. Already I've mentioned this and I expanded on this. So the reform proposed, he really think that students should weigh evidence. They can weigh evidence. They can compare alternatives. They can evaluate consequences and justify conclusions. This is why the meaning here for malakat al-hukm. So if they cannot do that, even if they memorize the arguments, they are failing. So teaching should include exercises. The teaching pedagogy should include exercises in application, prioritization, and reasoning through case studies, not merely recitation of rules and memorization. Memorize and have cases and apply. So reforming language instruction to restore its intellectual function. This is the fourth point. He also was critical in Zaytuna. He criticized how Arabic was taught as a technical system detached from thought. Students mastered grammatical phrases, rhetorical classification, but lack the ability to write clearly, argue persuasively, or express original ideas. So his reform, he proposed Arabic instruction should be oriented toward thinking, composition, and argumentation, treating language as an intellectual instrument rather than a set of constraints, rather than just memorizing, put it into practice. So fourth point as well, in just a summary, his main points, the integrating rational disciplines meaningfully into curriculum. So Ibn Ashur addressed the teaching of disciplines as logic, al-mantiq, and related rational sciences. He does not reject them, but criticize their isolation from real intellectual work. So what he proposes, logic and reasoning disciplines should be taught as tools for understanding texts, resolving problems, and guiding judgment, not just as an abstract form of systems memorized for their own sake. They are tools, instruments. They are not the purpose of education by themselves. So reconnecting, the sixth point he mentioned also, the critique, reconnecting education with social reality. This is so important to him, especially someone who's dealing with maqasid. He argues that education had become detached from contemporary social conditions. They're far away. They're like another world. Historical change and practical human needs demands education that is lively. This detachment renders scholars ineffective. They have scholarship, but ineffective to guide the society. Education should cultivate awareness of historical context, social change, and practical consequences, so that learning remains responsive and relevant to society. Also, the other point, the seventh one, encouraging disciplined ijtihad while preserving classical heritage scholarship. Ibn Ashur explicitly warns against, as I said, the two extremes, and critical imitation, taqlid, and reckless innovation. And he called for that students should be trained to engage in disciplined reasoning, grounded in classical scholarship, but capable of renewal, learning how to think within the Islamic scholarship, not merely what to repeat, what to recall from that heritage. And lastly, the reforming the role of the teacher, although less pragmatic, kind of program. Ibn Ashur is clear that reform cannot occur without rethinking teaching itself. He criticized teachers in Zaytuna who prioritize authority over explanation, discourage questioning, and reward conformity. So for him, teachers must function as intellectual guides, cultivating understanding and judgment rather than enforcing passive compliance. There is a lot that you find there. I stop here. There are many questions that we can raise. The questions of education will remain something that are open for debates. But I hope this gives enough context for Ibn Ashur's philosophy of education. Thank you so much. Jazakumullah khairan.
Thank you so much. It was very, very beneficial for all of us. If you have time, we can take some questions from our brothers and sisters, if you please. Okay.
Assalamu alaikum. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Ustaz, very, very thanks. We are very grateful to you. Ustaz, I have a question related to the lecture. A scholar once visited our university and in the course of discussion said, Allama Tahir ibn Ashur's educational philosophy is based on Maqasid al-Sharia. He grounded all his work on the framework of Maqasid al-Sharia. This philosophy does not fit at all with the current modern education system, especially the market-driven and skill-based educational structure. Such ideas are irrelevant in the modern world. Ustaz, in this case, what is actually the correct response? To what extent in Allama Tahir ibn Ashur's educational philosophy compatible with the modern educational system? Thank you.
Jazakallah khairan. So it's a very important question. Yes, here because they start from different philosophical understanding of the being and of the purposes of life and the purposes of education. And therefore, they will come to different measures of quality of education. Because if you have the purpose clear, then you ask yourself, am I achieving that purpose? What are the indicators to achieve that purpose? So you develop a framework of indicators for quality, and based on which then you can judge the any educational provision about their quality. So if the purpose is different completely, if the purpose, say, of a neoliberal education is about the market and about economy, and this is the most important things, how much profit you make, and therefore the quality of it becomes the numbers. Let's say in university, if I take university as an example, is not about how morally responsible those students who graduate from this university will act in society per se. It's not about that. It's about how much publications they make afterwards. How much did they get a job? What is the positions of that job after they live in 1 year from their graduation at the university? How many students graduated from these departments? Also, their satisfaction in terms of not necessarily their spirituality, about the services you provide, because they are customers here. The relationship between the learner and the teacher, not the teacher here, is the institution, have changed. And the teacher is someone, an employee within the institution to serve the customer who is the student who is coming. And therefore, the whole framework of ranking of universities, the world ranking of universities, is based on this kind of approach or worldview. That is the student is a customer, while in Islam, the student is a trust, is amana. The teacher is a moral responsible, while in the teacher is an employee. So 5 o'clock ends don't contact the teacher if this is a problem. So you'll find that framework. So the ranking itself is based on this. So how many, the scholar is not the scholar of the credibility of their embodiment of knowledge. The scholar is more about how many publications they publish per year, say, so for their appraisal, so to get promotion, or how much funding they get to the university, so they get more money. It's about money, it's about profit, it's about neoliberal. So that's why it's not, it's hard to combine the two, because you will need to sacrifice your maqsid. You need to develop your own. This is why something I wrote in one of my chapters about Islamic institutions, once they get into this game, and I know actually they will have at certain time, this is the system you have, because there is something ما لا يدرك كله لا يترك جله, means if you cannot achieve it, all of it, don't leave it all. Do what you can within it, but also don't stop at this. Think about alternatives when they are possible. So in this case, and also to be careful, because if I get into the system and all what I need is to tick boxes, and at the end I lose all my purpose of Islamic education. So I have to be careful as well of my priorities, and I have to ask myself, what are the criteria of my success in here, and what are the priorities? And this is why I called for a framework for quality based on the Islamic priorities, rather than these, the mainstream. We learn from them, we learn good practice, but we don't immerse into that system completely, because we lose by time, not once, at once, lose the essence and the purpose of the for what that institution of the first place was established. It becomes how many students I get, how many students they qualified. Nothing to do with the quality of teaching by of the moral learner, that ethical learner that graduating from those institutions. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, Ustaz, thank you. Thank you a lot.
And then Brother Abdurrahman Zami, you can ask your question.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Am I audible?
Alaikum salam. Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Jazakallah khairan, Ustaza. It's an honor to have you today in the seminar. And I was very mesmerizing to hear the lecture, because it was very detailed and very giving the hints that we have to rethink again about the educational philosophy, and we have to think about that how the system right now that we have to change, and we have to focus on the main parts that we lost actually. So thank you so much again for your very brightful lecture. So may Allah give you barakah, may Allah give you haya, may Allah increase your knowledge. So my question is that after hearing the whole lectures that we have prepared with lots of details and lots of efforts, can we say that Ibn Ashur purposes a form of purpose-oriented education rather than discipline-centered education? If so, how does this challenge traditional curricula?
Jazakallah khairan. It's my honor to be with you today. I'm always happy to be with the students of knowledge, and we are in your service, and this is part of the education philosophy in our civilization. So to the question about maqsid, the maqsid doesn't negate discipline. Actually, you'll find that is mentioning the responsibility, and responsibility comes as well with self-discipline that we've mentioned. So if I get your question right, to focus on the maqsid will not be achieved for him without the students be able to have, of course, they will have a memorization, but they don't stop in memorization. They will have the maqsid. But how can they achieve that maqsid in ongoing? They need first to check themselves, because if the person doesn't check their intentions and their inner self, their biases, their prejudice, they may issue rulings that that contradicts the purpose itself, doesn't achieve it. So that's why I mentioned before, is the inner part is part of the education, and the judgment cannot be by reasoning itself. It can be with reasoning, but that reasoning has to be also with self-check of what is my maqsid, what is my niyyah in here. And then I have also the reasoning, and I have the knowledge and information. They work together. I hope we clarify this point.
Yes, I got the answer. Jazakallah khair.
شكرا أستاذ عبد الرحمن.
Sister Nazia Tasnim, you can ask your question.
Assalamu alaikum, Ustaz.
عليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Thank you for your valuable speech. Your discussion was really relatable for most of our students. Inshallah, everyone will be benefited from your discussion. And thank you very much for this discussion and your valuable time. So I have a very simple question, Ustaz. How did Ibn Ashur maintain a balance between preserving the Islamic tradition or Turas and engaging in modern knowledge system without falling into intellectual imitation or taqlid? That's it.
Yeah, this is exactly his. That was the challenge that he was trying to reform within Zaytuna. He introduced some of the scientific subjects like chemistry, or he introduced them to Zaytuna curriculum to broaden the understanding of students. But his aim to balance is also to keep the classical sources, but to engage with them differently. So it's about the pedagogy, it's about approaching. So the students, for example, when they come, because I taught 5 years in Dar al-Ulum, I moved across different institutions. In Britain, I taught in Dar al-Ulum 5 years for girls, teaching al-Ikhtiyar, teaching the 6 books of Hadith. I have Ijaza for Sahihain. So I have the classical parts, teaching Usul al-Fiqh, teaching Usul al-Hadith. So that kind of part of the classical experience. But also I've been through the secular system of education through my upbringing before, and later on in Britain through the different universities, British and mainstream universities. So graduated with my master's and a PhD and work and moving across. So in that way, I can see parts that are missing, and I can relate to Ibn Ashur when he's mentioning both problems. So when looking into Dar al-Ulum schools, and I have to be very specific, this is an example I know is South Asia, which is a great to have is the classical books, and I don't believe any scholar of knowledge would be really at the level of scholarship without taking those books and study them from cover to cover with Sheikh. The universities mainstream, they don't give knowledge. What they give skills, research skills, analytical skills, but they don't give you the essence of knowledge. Even if you get a PhD in Islamic studies, you are more capable of analyzing, of doing this or doing this, but the students may not have ever read like al-Bukhari from cover to cover, or read the tafsir from cover to cover, or know about usul al-hadith, al-adala, and al-dabt, and all that. The same time, the students in Dar al-Ulum, they are restricted. They don't have the experience of analytical, how to approach critically to analyze, how to write, which the skills that Ibn Ashur is ahead of his time. And because I taught in both, and I taught students who come from Dar al-Ulum in the mainstream British universities. So the challenge that I face with them is they really into memorization. They want the question that just to recall. They cannot engage with any something. They have to analyze, and they have to debate, and they have to give alternative, and they have to apply. This is missing. And this partly is saying how they're excellent at memorization, but basically they're lacking on certain skills which are essential for nowadays to handle society, to deal with society in a lively way. You will find the scholar in Imam in Britain, they will find themselves in the BBC debating about something. They need to analyze on the spot, and yet they don't have this skill, despite the texts they have. The texts are very useful, but we need to balance. We need also to give, other skills, to develop other skills in Darul Uloom. For example, the research need to be included, I believe. Analysis, okay, debate. Why just they have to memorize? They have to kind of analyze those debates, engage with them from within, give them the alternative, give them the critique from outside, and let them, because that's, kind of develop their immune system as well, and develop them, prepare them for life. So I believe to balance is, Ibn Ashur tried this as well, and tried the teacher training, because he experienced the classical in Zaytuna, and he experienced at home the scholarly, and he experienced the secular in another institute in Tunis. So he can compare this. What we need is to preserve what we have, the excellence. I'm not, there are some people who are really against Darul Uloom and this, and I'm against that approach. I think there is a lot of good in those schools, and there is a lot of excellence that we can learn from that heritage. But we need to revive it from within by, okay, they have the books, they study the books, excellent. Okay, what else that is missing that have to be included, including, as I say, those skills that they have to be prepared. Not only they have to be prepared to reason, to be responsible, but also to analyze, to critique from within. To critique doesn't mean to reject. Part of critique is to find this is the strong evidence. I can say this is stronger than this. I can see this is the evidence. I can say, okay, this hadith doesn't have this or that. So this is part of critique. Doesn't mean as the other imitation that Ibn Ashur warns against is the imitation of the other, of the imported, and come and say, I don't need the heritage. Through it, I don't need Darul Uloom. Import schools, ready-made, international. Bring them, and then we are modern. We are not. Because this is what Ibn Nabi, and I recommend that you may read for Malik bin Nabi, and his theory about civilization and how to revive the Ummah again. And he thinks that the problem, we have dead ideas, and then because they're dead, we are just imitating now, stagnant, frozen. We go and import killing ideas from others because they worked somewhere else. Doesn't mean they work for us. They worked because they emerged from within. They have efficacy within their effectiveness is from within their cultures, from within their context, from within their worldview. If we bring them and import them, they don't work. They kill us. So it has to be from within. There is something that is different from Ibn Ashur and Taha Abdurrahman. I'd recommend that you read for Taha Abdurrahman as well. Taha Abdurrahman would disagree. I didn't come across any of engagement with Ibn Ashur from him, but Ibn Ashur is about logic, the classical logic. He's along Al-Ghazali. I would say he's he's from that school, so he's not critical of the classical kind of logic inherited, and he thinks this is taken for granted. This is what we need. We need to teach students that logic, but as instrument, not as a goal in itself. And we need to see how they use it from within, self-discipline as well, and in a more of judgment and insight. But Taha Abdurrahman would critique the logic itself. That is, this logic is not ethical, and therefore we need akhlaq in the preparation of logic itself. So don't take it for granted. And this is part of critique. Now, when I'm raising this and giving you one side of Ben Nabi, for example, explains civilization decline and revival within broader conditions of society. It's about thaqafa, it's about culture. And then he analyzed what culture is, and then analyzed the different elements of culture. So, and then, Ibn Ashur, he focused on the purposes and maqasid and the pedagogy and curriculum. So less of curriculum, more about the purpose, then the curriculum will come afterwards based on the purpose. I don't see them contradicting. I see they complement each other in a way, and it's healthy debate to have.
Ustad, thank you so much. If you have time, we can take one more question if you have
One
time.
more question, then I go, because it's Maghrib. Now is 15 minutes since Maghrib, the adhan. Yeah.
Okay, Brother Abdul Al Moin, please.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
My sound is okay?
Yep.
Before moving forward, I would like to thank for having this session, and I feel honored to have been a part of this wonderful discussion. And your words are not only just informative but also profoundly impactful for all of us. The passion and expertise you brought to this session have made it truly memorable for all of us. So we hope that we will meet in another session, another discussion, inshallah. So my question is, does Ibn Ashur's educational thought allow for philosophical science and humanities as autonomous fields, or are they always subordinate to religious knowledge? What is your opinion?
Yeah. Okay. That is an important question is going on in education. So for Ibn Ashur, he himself multidisciplinary scholar. He's a cyclopedic himself about his knowledge. So he studied philosophy, he studied languages, he speaks other languages, he studied humanities, and he's very, very scholarly in Islamic classics. So from his own embodied journey of being a scholar, we can see that he doesn't see the contradiction between studying this. I think what he's looking for is not the curriculum, what you study. You may read here, you may read there, but how you approach it. Do you have the capabilities of being critical about what you study? So if I now go out and study, for example, Habermas and Arendt, or so and so or so, without mentioning many others here, I will have definitely thought that some of it I may find benefit in it, some of it I might find it contradicting. But do I have the skill? Do I have to take everything or reject everything? So for Ibn Ashur's thought, we have to prepare our students to be in the world. That means they can interact with any other knowledge, and they will be able to recognize their purposes and their framework and be critical and engage in that. Rather than try to protect them by imitation and isolate them. Because for him, if we do that, what will happen after they leave us, they may go to extremes. They may go complete isolation, imitation, they just recall text, or they go into, okay, now I am free, this is nothing, I don't need that heritage, I can import something and I'm now modernized. Because why? Because the same process software, we didn't prepare them to engage and to know what to take and what not to take. So for him, I don't see that he would reject having, studying philosophy at all, because that's part of his asking for a broadening and discussion and critique. But he would also, of course, he would reject studying it with inferiority, studying it with uncritical approach. That is the problem. The problem is not to study it or not. The problem how to approach it, how to study it. And then, Sahaba, they read other, they were open to knowledge. Tabi'in later on, when they opened the Islamic civilization. And our scholars, you'll find Al-Ghazali, you'll find Ibn Taymiyyah. If you read Ibn Taymiyyah, people, they quote Ibn Taymiyyah in a very restricted way. But if you read Ibn Taymiyyah, you see the depth of philosophical depth he has. And also Imam Al-Ghazali, you see how the philosophical depth he has. This doesn't negate be steadfast, and your classics, and your principles, and your framework. But of course, If not ready, if there is no immune, if we put it another way, if there is no immune system prepared, then whatever they take, what they read, this is the fact, this is the truth, and just take it. And whatever they read, this is the truth, and they just take it. This is why, you know, you find some of them, they're from classical studies, they come to Western context universities, suddenly they are calling for relativism, calling for this heritage tradition, we don't need it, we need education. They were parts of it. Why? Because they were not prepared to engage with that shock and to engage with the critique. I hope I answered your question.
Okay. Thank you so much. We are deeply grateful to you for your insightful contribution, clarity of thought, and the way you connected complex ideas with the lived realities. And I also thank to all of our participants and for their reflections and attentive presence, which greatly enriched our session. So inshallah, see you in the next session, and I will request Ustaza Fella Lahmar to give us more time if you have in the future. Thank you again. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum.
عليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته. جزاكم الله خير.